And Dr. Steve Pieczenik joins us now to talk about the story that Alex just covered. The headline on the Daily Mail: Republicans hit out at unethical psychiatrists who claim Donald Trump has a dangerous mental illness. You know, it's funny, Dr. Pieczenik, to have this story going out there when I think that there has been a lot more evidence of mental illness on the side of the anti-Trumpers than out of Donald Trump. But Dr. Steve Pieczenik, what were the first thoughts that came to your head when you saw this story?
Well, the first thoughts that came to my head, number one, let me clarify who I am in psychiatry. Not only am I board certified, but I have been a board examiner for 10 years. So if Dr. Gilligan or any psychiatrist had come in front of me and declared that Trump was mentally ill because of their observations that they just made, they would have flunked their boards. In other words, they wouldn't have become psychiatrists. And I have literally flunked over 60% of psychiatrists who passed their written exams and have not passed their orals. In effect, these people have no idea what they're talking about. Number one, not one of them has ever been with a president of the United States, let alone 5 presidents. Not one of them understands the specific dynamics of a politician, which entails the following 3 elements. One is narcissism, which is healthy and says, I am important. We have that. Those psychiatrists have it, because otherwise they wouldn't be speaking out and they wouldn't be so grandiose as to say, dare to warn or duty to warn.
Yeah, listen to us.
That's correct. So they have that narcissism, they have that grandiosity, and they have that paranoia that something will happen. And that's quite antisocial. Now, I can use all of those 3 elements in psychiatric terms and make sure none of them ever pass their exams in psychiatry. However, what they're trying to bring up, and they do it in a fallacious manner, is that they do not understand what the politics of and the dynamics of a president is all about. We had a very sick president of the United States. Unfortunately, we never talked about it, and that was John F. Kennedy, who had Addison's disease, certified, bona fide Addison's disease, absence of adrenal gland, was on amphetamines, on steroids, on drugs on a daily basis. Now, I say this as a Cornell University medical school graduate whose teachers were, in fact, the ones who treated him and warned me that this man was quite dangerous and psychotic and really had no idea what he was doing. As a result of his inability to deal with reality, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis. Then we had the nonsensical stories that cover up his history of ineffectualness and dysfunctionalism, calling it Camelot. So in effect, most of these people who work for Dare to Warn or Duty to Warn have no idea of the dynamics of presidents. Woodrow Wilson was sick while in the last year of his presidency, and the presidency was run by his wife. FDR was sick. He forced anybody who took a picture of him in his crippled chair to be arrested or incarcerated or taken away. Now, the notion of using, and Alex is correct, the notion of using psychiatric diagnosis for political ends is very dangerous. My first assignments under the Nixon administration through the National Institute of Mental Health, where I was very high up, was in fact to go to the Soviet Union and release Christian dissidents who were political dissidents, happened to be Christians, but were diagnosed as sluggish schizophrenia. Now, what's happening now in Dare to Duty or Duty to Warn, they're putting psychiatric terms in a very dangerous ideological format. The Russians did that. The Soviets did that. We had to break it apart. We American psychiatrists broke it apart to eventually take down the Soviet Union. Well, now, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, and let's be clear, too. I mean, if we're going to sit here and start pointing fingers at politicians who might have, mental problems, I think the fingers should be pointed first at the likes of a John McCain, a Nancy Pelosi, a Maxine Waters. It's amazing how they just completely forget all of that. And then you have all the stories that develop on Hillary Clinton's health. She's got gaps in her tongue. She's coughing up things into cups. She's having, she can't stop coughing. She's fainting. No coverage on that. Now, all of a sudden, though, it's Trump that has a mental illness. And what I think is going on here, Steve, is, and this is the type of thing we see with lawyers, with the ACLU. It's the same exact thing. You have people that are using their title and using their status to spread slander by my opinion, by my estimation, with this most recent development with what they're accusing or trying to allege of Trump.
I would agree with your last point that, in fact, this is slanderous. If I were Trump and if I were he, I would sue them because it's triple damages. Then they would understand what it means to be in a court of law to present a diagnosis which is, one, incorrect. Two, he has no mental illness because even if he is narcissistic, even if he is grandiose, even if he has delusion, you know what? He has built a multi-billion-dollar business. He has built 15 years of television, outstanding shows, and he became president of the United States. There is no jury in the world that would accept the diagnosis of mental illness. There is a jury of the Ethics Committee of the American Psychiatric Association that should come in and indict them for malpractice and a violation of the Goldwater Act, which means that no psychiatrist, including myself, can make a diagnosis about a man's mental health illness or a woman's without having interviewed that person. Now I come back again. I'm sure that most of them, if not all of them, have never treated a politician. I mean, a congressman or a senator. If they had, they would understand that the basic underlying dynamics of going into politics, even into movies, even into literature, one is narcissism. Two is the notion that you can become greater than you are and you want to be greater. That's grandiosity, but that's healthy. The third is if you're in a hierarchical system, you are concerned about who's around you and who's going to do what to you, backbiting. That's called paranoid. Now, every one of those psychiatrists who became chairman of the department or became the head of some institution or nonsensical title had all three elements. And if they don't see it within themselves, they've got a problem. Now, we have generals and we have other people around him who, in fact, talk to him all the time. A mentally ill individual would not have 20 different people to whom he talks to on a daily basis for his opinion. Is it true that maybe he's not certain of his job? That may be so. That's not mental illness. Is it true that being president of the United States is kind of an overwhelming role? I would agree with that. I've seen that in many presidents. Is it true that when you're president of the United States, you become a little insecure? That's correct. Is it true that you have to lie at times in order to protect the republic? Because Winston Churchill says a nation must hide behind a bodyguard of lies. So if these therapists knew anything about political science, which they don't, that's why I went on to MIT and Harvard to learn psychiatry and political science. And we had specialists trained by Eric Erickson to teach us about the dynamics of politicians and world dynamics. None of these people are qualified. They've never had that experience. They've never been close to the president of the United States. They've never been overseas. They've never created a Camp David Accord. They never took apart the Soviet Union. They really don't understand anything other than their own narcissism and their own sense of grandiosity. And that's what we call projection. So if they want to continue this, I strongly suggest the ethics committee come in from the American Psychiatric Association, if they have any guts, and start to question each one of them. Then I would strongly suggest that the Trump family sue every one of them for slander and see what happens. Then you will see how psychiatrists and psychologists and social workers, who are basically meek in terms of their own careers because they're afraid to take risks. They go through and they write their own little books of narcissism that nobody ever reads, and then they go out and make a statement which is absurd. He is not mentally ill. He never will be mentally ill. He doesn't drink. He doesn't smoke. He doesn't take drugs. I'm sure that's a lot more than the 41,000 people who signed up for this nonsensical group.
Dr. Steve Pieczenik is on fire. We will be right back. Alex Jones Show on a Sunday.
I think they're too arrogant and ignorant to retract it. And let me tell you why I think they're totally ignorant. Forget the psychiatric part where I said it was incorrect diagnosis because he doesn't have a mental illness. Three of those elements, narcissism, aggrandizement, delusion, even paranoid, are consistent with anybody's personality who's in politics, the theater, movies, or books. But what makes it ironical is that they're so stupid this group, and so arrogant that the Yale Medical School had no idea that the first book ever written about psychiatry and personal and politics was written at Yale in 1927. That's how stupid Yale is. And that's how dysfunctional that medical school is. The man's name was Harold Laswell, Lasswel. He was a man who taught me, he taught Lucian Pye, all from Yale, Iffield de Solapool, in 1960s and the 70s, about how psychiatry and politics goes together. But they're so stupid at Yale that I would, if I were Dr. Prince or Price, the head of HHS, I would decrease their funding. I would go into the Yale Medical School and clean out that entire medical staff, because they're so arrogant, they're so ignorant, that if this is what they're producing, they shouldn't be functioning. If they didn't know that Harold Laswell was the father of the field of political psychiatry and psychology, they are dumb. They're just plain arrogant and dumb, as well as Lucian Pye, all the PhDs that we got. That's why psychiatrists, psychologists, and mental health professionals failed repeatedly. That's why I flunked over 60% of them. I trained at Harvard, and they were terrible at Harvard. And most of these psychiatrists have no idea beyond their own navel what really goes on in the real world, in the political world, in the international world, other than their own narcissism. And with a left-wing ideology or a right-wing ideology, it doesn't matter. Stupidity finds an ideological purpose, but understanding and having a sagacious mind means that you have to learn something other than your own narcissism and your own belly button, so that they didn't go out of their way to look up in the Yale Medical School and the Yale Social Science Department. Harold Laswell was the father of this entire field that I'm in, political psychiatry and psychology, where Lucian Pye, Richard Solomon, and 7 or 8 of us graduated with PhDs, and we became the deputy assistant secretaries under Nixon, Ford, Reagan, Carter, Bush, so on and so forth. So what you have here is the arrogance and stupidity of a group of people, whether it's on the left or the right is irrelevant. But collectively, you see how dangerous they are. And in a way, Alex is correct. When they have this groupthink and they're dysfunctional, they go to extremes. And when they go to extremes, they do exactly what you said, Owen. Everybody has a mental illness. I happen to have been a senior official at the NIMH in the 70s when the American Psychiatric Association and Mel Sapshin called me in, and they wanted to develop the DSM-1, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual 1. And I warned them, if you keep doing this, you will have a book 5 and 6, which they have now, where everybody, but everyone, will have a diagnostic illness category so that you can make money. Because the real issue in psychiatry is, how do we build a patient if we're doing psychotherapy 45 to 50 minutes a day? That came out of the psychoanalytical school, and it came out of Freud. And where I was trained by analysts and others at Harvard who had no idea how to commoditize their time. So what happened was the American Psychiatric Association became money hungry, affiliated themselves with all the drug companies, and I left. I left because I found that there was no integrity, there was no basic gravitas, and the intellectual basis of that institution was failing. That was true of psychology, where we saw their involvement, the American Psychological Association, in the 9/11 interrogation of so-called terrorists. And they charged us millions of dollars. These were inept psychologists who got contracts from the CIA. So what really has to happen is the investigation of psychologists, mental health workers, and psychiatrists. And let's reverse the entire system to find out exactly what they know, exactly what they do not know, and how dysfunctional they have become. That's what I would do if I were in power. Because it's time to turn the table and say, okay, let me see what you know. Let me see what you're capable of. And in my opinion, very little. They push drugs. They have no other idea. And one of them, Gilligan, thinks he's an expert because he treats violent people in a mental institution, Bridgewater. I used to send patients from Mass Mental Health to Bridgewater. That's not a qualification for anything in terms of politics or in terms of world affairs. I ran the St. Elizabeth units for the criminally insane as well. That didn't put me in the position of understanding the various presidents, the vagaries of political systems, and the dynamics of them. In fact, what you've seen is stupidity writ large.
Well, I actually studied psychology when I was at college, too. And I remember at the university I went to, I had a professor that said, look, take the DSM with a grain of salt. They change it every year. There's a huge consortium of people that are just working with pharmaceutical companies to try to push drugs down our throats. You just broke that down in the most cutting edge fashion as it can get. But real quick, Dr. Pieczenik, what does it say about these people's entitlement where they're obviously upset with the results of the election, whether it be they liked Hillary, they predicted Trump could never win, whatever it be? Clearly, this is just in a response to them not liking the results of the election. They think they can just make these claims? They can just make these claims and have them stick because they're upset over an election result? And you're telling me they're not mentally ill?
Well, I don't think they're mentally ill. I don't think any of them are mentally ill. Of course, I said Donald Trump is not mentally ill, and I don't think any of those people who made those statements. What they are is arrogant, dysfunctional, inept, and highly discredited. They're very clearly inept in terms of understanding ideological differences, and so they use the only weapon they have, which is to categorize people into mental health categories.
We'll be right back.
Well, I'm amazed that it's relevant today, but 33 years ago, when I was in the Soviet Union, I was working in the 1970s under the order of the National Institute of Mental Health and President Nixon to go into the psychiatric hospitals in the Soviet Union, and particularly in Moscow, what was called the Pieczenik psychiatric hospitals, where dissidents who happened to be Baptists, Anabaptists, Christians were diagnosed and given a diagnosis which never existed called sluggish schizophrenia. That's very much like these people who are now calling Trump, who doesn't have mental illness, he's dysfunctional and antisocial. Absolute nonsense. But the Soviets used it in such a way that they didn't have to bring him, as you would say, through the court system in their system. So we were able, I and others who were involved in taking down the Soviet Union, we were able to go to the Pieczenik Psychiatric Hospital. I negotiated with the last doctor who worked with Stalin to get dissidents out of the Pieczenik Psychiatric Hospital and commoditize them with Wang computers. Now, what do I mean? In order to spare the Soviets their indignation, and I didn't want to hear about their human rights abuses, I said, look, if Mr. X is here, it happens, he's a dissident, I'll give you 5 Wang computers. In those days, we had Wang. For another person, I would give you 4 Wang computers, and so on and so forth. We got hundreds of dissidents out of that psychiatric hospital. But just like what they were doing in Dare to Duty or Duty to Warn, this is very dangerous to walk into a political system and use psychiatric or psychological diagnosis to incarcerate people and to designate them as mentally ill. The Soviets were brilliant at it. Eventually, we were able to take down their country because of their weakness. I warn those who do this, and I'm part of that group, that if you don't cease and desist, you will see exactly what will happen to you is what happened to the Soviet Union. I don't know who funds you. I don't know who's backing you. But clearly, you're way beyond your own capabilities, and you're in a field that you know nothing about. You were never trained in national character. You were never trained in international relations. You never worked in the executive branch, either in terrorism, counterterrorism, or intelligence, and you really never understood the dynamics of politicians. Having said that, that's a clear warning to these people that they're treading very dangerous grounds, politically, economically, and elsewise.
Well, and you make a fair comparison there between Soviet communist practices and practices that we're now seeing from what I would call the political left. That's my words, not yours. But I'm just curious, just real quick, could we get into this? Because I think it might help people understand a little bit more, myself included. What was the motive? Get in more to the motives behind the Soviets wanting to bring in all of these dissidents and claim all these mental disorders.
It's a very good point, Owen. The key point is just what they're trying to do with Trump. In other words, in order to avoid the legal system, even within the Soviet Union, where we in the United States and in the intelligence community and elsewhere, we could track where the dissidents were. They hid them under a mental label that was called sluggish schizophrenia, never existed in worldwide psychiatry, and they were able to shuffle them from one hospital to another, interrogate them, use all kinds of techniques to make them to kowtow, to be able to frighten them. And using that system, they were able to break the dissidents. Now, I don't think Putin uses that now. I think the Russians don't use that, but that was used in well into the 70s, 80s, and even the 90s until we took it down. Now, what I'm warning the left and the right, if you use mental illness as a way of discrediting someone who you don't like ideologically or for whatever reason, you better be careful, because you're treading on dangerous grounds. You then will be culpable for malpractice, for ignorance, for all kinds of professional violations, which have to do with the Goldwater Act, when the whole group of psychiatrists decided that Goldwater was paranoid because they didn't like his particular ideology on the right. Now it comes to you and me, Owen, and Alex Jones, where we're called conspirators. That's fine. Yeah, I'm proud to be a conspirator because 9/11 was a conspiracy. Sandy Hook was a conspiracy. My training in intelligence and in those fields allowed me to say to the CIA, you pull this again and you see what happens. You see what happens when you get a Hillary Clinton or you get a Gaddafi or Libya, and you'll see how you'll disappear. So what I'm saying in effect is there are those of us who are far more sophisticated than this group of neophytes who think that they can do whatever they're doing. And we will make certain that they will pay a very heavy price for this. Is this politically motivated? Of course. Do they know anything beyond their narrow scope? No. They're so ignorant that I told you again at Yale University, that was the lodestar for national character, for political psychiatry, and that then went to MIT. Yet they had no idea what they were talking about. I would look at the NIH grants or NIMH grants that go to Yale Medical School in general, and I would be very careful to assign them any kinds of major funds, because repeatedly they have come up as a problem. In Sandy Hook, it was a psychiatrist at Yale that created this Adam Lazarus, some character that never existed. It was an RN psychiatric nurse who corroborated that the man who never existed was involved in Sandy Hook and killed 22 people. So Yale Medical School and Yale University is a real problem. What they have done in effect is to bring the heat down on them once again because of their arrogance and their ignorance.
Yeah, I'm sure that you're not going to hear it for that last Sandy Hook statement. But going back, you talked about the communist Soviets. Basically, it's a 1984 soft disappearance with this claim of a mental disorder that they were using to silence dissenters. But, it's funny because you also made some very powerful statements when talking about these psychiatrists, essentially, breaking protocol to make these accusations. I'm seeing this all across the board. To be honest with you, Dr. Pieczenik, I'm seeing this from lawyers. I'm seeing this from politicians. I mean, by my measurement, if you're out there spreading, whether it be fake news about Trump being mentally deranged, or whether it be fake news about Trump being a Russian operative, or fake news about Trump harassing this woman or that or the other thing, all of that to me is slanderous. All of that to me needs to start getting hit with lawsuits. I'm just curious, do you really think that this might be the one to break the back of all of these people that by my stretch have been breaking the law and need to have something come after them? Do you think this is finally the one that will break it, or is this just going to get shoved under the bed like the rest of it?
I think you've hit on something quite important. If I were the Trump family, this is the one that I would hit them with. And this is the one that I would ask Republican senators and congressmen to get together and call a hearing and bring in the Dr. Gilligans and Garnett and Lilly, all those people who are so certain of their diagnosis, to explain to the American public how they came to that diagnosis, what made them qualified to say it, and give them the airtime to sink themselves and to show how pathetic they really are in general, that's what I would do. I would then sue them, and I would let Trump do whatever he wants. But honestly, I would want them in front of the public. I want them in front of Congress and the Senate. And I would want Yale Medical School to explain why they continuously have these hearings, although they disavow any affiliation. That's disingenuous. Yale University has repeatedly been in trouble with all these false flags and the Kerrys and the Bushes and all that nonsense that Alex correctly said about Skull and Bones. But more importantly, Sandy Hook and other elements where I think it's time that Yale be examined very carefully. Clearly, it's non-professional and it's absurd. But the most important thing I think the audience should realize is, number one, we're still in the process of a second American Revolution. Trump got in. We put him in there. Some of the things he's doing, I really don't like, but that doesn't constitute mental illness. I mean,
that shows that you're sane, actually.
That's correct. I mean, he's doing things that I don't particularly like, but there are things he does that I do like in terms of the taxes.
Yeah, just a real interjection. It would show mental disorder. I think it would show you have a mental disorder if you just agree wholeheartedly with anything an individual does. That, to me, shows a sign of mental disorder. But back to you, Dr. Pieczenik.
The mental disorder was very obvious in John F. Kennedy. I mean, the intelligence community knew it. The military knew it. We all knew it in the political science arena that he had a serious mental disorder, but it didn't look like that because the system was able to say that his tan wasn't part of Addison's disease, a pathology. It was the fact that he was a sportsman and could run around in Cape Cod, which was nonsense. But let's go back to the key issue. Number one, there'll be uncertainty. I understand that. Number two, we seem to be approaching two different conflicts. One is North Korea, one is Syria. My suspicion is that both our military generals, that is General Mattis, Kelly, and McMaster, all three of them will prevent a war. But what they're doing is signaling in through the movement of troops and through a presumed airstrike that we will not tolerate any kind of bullying either on the part of North Korea or on the part of Syria. Now, the warning I have for our administration has nothing to do with mental illness. It has to do with my having been in Syria and being interrogated by Bashar Assad and having understood one thing about Bashar Assad. He will never leave. So our attempt to get rid of Bashar Assad is wasteful. It's at the same time dangerous because Bashar Assad and the Assad family, they're Alawites, but they protect 2 million Christians. I've said this repeatedly. If Bashar leaves for any reason, millions of Christians will be slaughtered. I warned that in terms of Egypt with the Coptics. They didn't listen to me. There were 20 churches that were burned, eventually 200 churches. Then I warned about our invasion into Iraq. I said that Chaldeans, the Assyrians, will be slaughtered. They were slaughtered. I am warning now to the people in the Trump administration, do not go in and take out Bashar Assad. The CIA is wrong. They have no understanding of what this is about. I've been involved with Bashar. I fought against him. I fought against his father. But if you take him out, I will guarantee you hundreds of thousands or millions of Christians will die. Now, that's the type of concerns that I have in this administration. The second concern is I don't want to see Jared Kushner or Ivanka Trump in the White House. That's not of interest to me. I didn't vote for her. I didn't vote for him. I voted for Trump. If he is uncertain, then let him appoint others. But I certainly don't want the panoply of Goldman Sachs investment bankers, many of whom I know about and have never created a company, never taken a risk on their own, and got fat doing nothing. Now, how do I know that? I was managing director of Kidder Peabody. I took it down, and I got rid of $600 million. So if Goldman Sachs thinks they can run a government, they better think again. So what I'm saying to our people, the people of the Alex Jones, the people of the InfoWars, they call us conspirators, they call us right-wing nuts, whatever they want to call us, we have to continue to make sure that our word is heard, and we feel very strongly that Trump may not be going in the right direction. That doesn't mean he's mentally ill. That means we don't agree with what he's doing.
And that's a very important point because we put Trump in office. Not the media. See, the media is confused about that. The media thinks they can take Trump down. They didn't put Trump in office. They can't take him down. We put Trump in office. We will decide where the ship goes. Real quick, Dr. Pieczenik, I want to get your take on a couple things before we get you off here. Now, We know that the narrative that the Democrats tried to play during the election was that Trump was either working for or in collusion with the Russians and WikiLeaks. Now, since then, obviously, you mentioned Syria, but the Trump administration, the United States, is now pivoted against Russia and now pivoted against WikiLeaks. How much of that do you think is brinksmanship, and how much of that do you think is the real deal?
I don't think it's the real deal. Number one, Julian Assange was very helpful to many of us in terms of the leakage. I think Pompeo was wrong as a director of the CIA. I don't know him. I don't think he has an intelligence background. He was at West Point, but that's not relevant to me. His deputy director was involved in the torture of many of so-called terrorists. I'm not happy about that. But let's go back into WikiLeaks. They were very important in terms of our revolution and getting Trump in there. The Russians had nothing to do what Alex Jones, myself, and others who were involved, I will not name them, got involved so that Trump could be where he is. And he has to remember that. It was not the media. It was not the Heritage Foundation. It was not the Mercers. It wasn't even Bannon and Breitbart. It was Alex Jones and the InfoWar audience of millions of people who started not 5 years ago or 6 years ago. We started 14 years ago when Alex brought me on board to talk about 9/11. So that's the key that we have to run through. That's even though you think, even though that the Trump administration and Trump himself has moved the chess pieces on the board into completely checkmating the Trump-Russia collusion and the Trump-WikiLeaks-Russia collusion, completely checkmating those, do you still think they're going to go forward with those narratives despite the brinksmanship from Trump? I don't think so. I think what will happen that they'll just say, I think no one's going to indict Julian Assange for what? For helping us out? He has not been a terrorist. He has not created any damage. If anything, we should have made him a U.S. citizen. So I don't agree with the statements. The second part is very important. Russia will always be our ally. They were our ally in World War II. They took the brunt of the war, as Marshall said, Eisenhower said, and every other president knows that. Russia is not the Soviet Union. Putin has his own problems. Putin now knows he's got 82 districts where there's 600,000 truckers who are on strike and don't want to haul any of the goods through Russia. So he's got his own problems. He doesn't need to get into our situation. The problem was Hillary Clinton, and the book is correct. We had read it correctly. I said from day one, this was not a woman who understood strategy. She did not understand tactics. She was so arrogant and so ignorant of the moves that she should have made that she didn't listen to her advisors. Now, why do I say that? I said because if Trump could use the Twitter and Hillary had to spend $100 million and still didn't listen to her advisors, that's self-destructive. And it was obvious to me that she was self-destructive. And Bill Clinton even recognized that point.
Now, does this reverberate then? Keep going down that road. Final minute of the show. Is this reverberating on the political left?
This woman who could have been the president of the United States, who should have been in many ways, who's not lazy, she's not stupid, but was so arrogant and so ignorant of what she had to do. Her arrogance totally self-destructed her. And she didn't even listen to Bill Clinton. And I watched that. And I said, this is one of the biggest mistakes in the Clinton administration, because if she had listened to him, she might have won the electoral votes, but she didn't. And she didn't even listen to Dewey Square or any other consultants. $100 million went down the drain. It isn't that we won that successfully to Trump. It's that she was so self-destructive that it was obvious to me and others who developed strategy and tactics where we're not in the front line, but we were working with Alex Jones, that it was easy to hit her and her team. I couldn't believe that.
Steve Pieczenik, thank you so much. We got to go. I think the same story, self-destruction leading to the end of the left.